Something unusual is starting to line up across agriculture this morning. Energy markets are coming down slightly, fertilizer supplies are tightening. Several grain importing countries appear to be quietly building reserves, and weather patterns across the United States are swinging both drought and flooding just weeks before planting begins. Any one of those stories can move markets, but when they start stacking on top of each other at the same time, agriculture can become extremely sensitive to the next headline. So the real question for producers this morning isn't just where prices are closed today. The real question is this: are these pressures setting the stage for the next move in the markets that feed America? Let's start with where markets closed. Corn futures closed near 453 per bushel. Soybeans finished the day around 1196. Chicago wheat ended the session close to 603. Live cattle closed near $230.15 per hundredweight. Feeder cattle finished around $346.55. Lean hogs closed near 94.82. Meanwhile, crude oil came down just a bit to 88.58, down $6.62 per barrel. So on the surface, grain markets look relatively steady while cattle markets slipped lower and energy dropped a bit. But underneath those numbers, several pressure points are starting to build across agriculture. This morning, we're going to look at four of them: fertilizer supply tightening, grain reserve buying overseas, margin pressure inside cattle markets, and the weather pattern that could influence planting across the United States. So let's start with fertilizer. One of the most important developments happening in agriculture right now isn't showing up clearly on the future screen yet. It's happening in fertilizer markets. The Middle East plays a major role in global nitrogen fertilizer trade. Large volumes of ammonia and urea move through the region each year, and those products are critical inputs for corn production around the world. Right now, geopolitical tensions are beginning to disrupt parts of that supply chain. Shipping uncertainty, insurance costs, and logistical delays are all starting to ripple through the fertilizer market, and timing is everything. Farmers across the United States are entering the period when fertilizer purchases accelerate ahead of spring planting. If fertilizer availability tightens or prices begin rising sharply, growers start adjusting acreage plans quickly. Corn requires large nitrogen applications. Soybeans require far less. So when nitrogen becomes expensive, some operations reconsider how many corn acres they want to plant. Those shifts don't have to be huge to influence markets. Across the Corn Belt, even a small percentage change in acreage can move supply expectations. That's why traders are watching fertilizer markets closely right now, because fertilizer isn't just an input cost. It's one of the earliest signals that acreage decisions could start changing. Another storyline quietly unfolding involves global grain demand. Whenever geopolitical tensions rise, countries that rely heavily on imported grain start thinking about supply security. Instead of waiting until supplies tighten, they sometimes begin purchasing grain earlier than normal to build reserves. That strategy is common among countries that depend heavily on imported food. Nations such as Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, and parts of Asia often accelerate purchases when shipping routes or geopolitical tensions become uncertain. Those moves don't always show up in headlines immediately. Instead, they tend to appear first in export data. Sudden increases in export sales can signal that buyers are building reserves. When several countries begin doing this at the same time, global demand for wheat and corn can increase quickly. That type of buying pressure can shift the balance between supply and demand faster than many people expect. For farmers watching markets, export demand is one of the fastest forces capable of moving grain prices. So even when domestic conditions appear stable, global demand changes can quickly alter the outlook. Now let's turn to the livestock side of the market. Cattle prices remain historically strong. The United States is operating with one of the smallest cattle herds seen in decades, which has supported prices across the beef sector. But futures markets are beginning to react to a different concern: costs. Feedlot and backgrounding operations are watching several cost factors move at the same time. Feed costs remain tied closely to grain markets. Fuel prices influence transportation and operating expenses. Fertilizer costs eventually work their way into feed grain production. When several cost pressures start rising together, cattle margins can tighten quickly. That doesn't mean cattle markets suddenly collapse, but it does introduce volatility. Feeder cattle futures often respond early when traders begin thinking about margin pressure. Those futures represent the cost of animals entering feedlots. When feedlots anticipate higher margins ahead, they become more cautious about placements. That's why traders often watch feeder cattle futures for early signals about how the industry is thinking. Right now, the cattle industry still benefits from tight supply, but markets are beginning to watch input costs closely. Now let's talk about weather, because weather eventually becomes one of the biggest drivers of agricultural markets every year. Right now, the United States is experiencing a mixed pattern. Parts of the plains remain dry after several seasons of drought. Areas of Kansas, Nebraska, and portions of the western Corn Belt continue to deal with limited soil moisture. At the same time, storm systems moving across the central United States are bringing significant rainfall to other regions. Some areas of the eastern Corn Belt are seeing repeated storm activity. That creates a strange situation. Some producers are hoping for moisture. Others are hoping fields can dry out enough for early field work. Weather volatility this time of year can influence several critical decisions. Fertilizer applications depend on the field conditions. Planting progress depends on soil temperature and moisture. And early crop development depends on how quickly fields warm up this spring. Even before planting begins, weather expectations can shift market sentiment. If traders believe planting could be delayed, markets often start reacting weeks in advance. If soil moisture conditions improve significantly, expectations can change just as quickly. So while weather hasn't taken center stage yet, it remains one of the most powerful forces agriculture watches every spring. When we step back and look at all these factors together, a broader picture begins to emerge. Energy prices are coming down just a bit. Fertilizer markets are tightening. Some countries may be increasing grain purchases. Livestock markets are watching operating costs, and weather conditions remain unpredictable heading into planting season. Individually, each of these forces can influence agriculture, but when several of them appear at the same time, markets tend to become more sensitive to news headlines. The next development in any of these areas could shift sentiment quickly. That's why traders often describe periods like this as markets waiting for direction. Sometimes the biggest moves happen when several smaller pressures finally line up. So this morning, the futures board showed relatively calm prices across grains and livestock. Corn near 453, soybeans around 1196, Chicago wheat near 603, live cattle near $230.15, feeder cattle around $346.55, lean hogs close to 94.82, and crude oil at 88.15 per barrel. But underneath those numbers, several important forces are beginning to build. Fertilizer supply pressure, global grain reserve buying, rising costs inside cattle markets, and a weather pattern that could influence planting across large portions of the United States. Any one of these developments could shift market expectations quickly. And when agriculture enters periods where multiple pressures begin stacking together, markets often become much more responsive to the next headline. That's the environment agriculture appears to be moving right now. This has been Boots and Bushels, the markets that feed America, and we'll see you tomorrow.